The nation was glued to their television screens. It was the primetime hour, and the most controversial political talk show in America was about to feature a guest who had largely stayed out of the limelight, Usha Vance, the wife of Vice President JD Vance. Despite being a successful lawyer in her own right, Usha had rarely stepped into the political fray. Her appearances had always been measured, her words chosen carefully. But tonight was different. She had accepted an invitation to The American Voice, a liberal-leaning show hosted by Rachel Monroe, a fiery anchor known for her relentless questioning of conservative figures. The anticipation was electric. Conservatives expected Usha to be grilled, possibly ambushed, while liberals were eager to see her stumble. But no one, not even Monroe herself, was prepared for what was about to unfold. As the show began, Monroe wasted no time getting to the point. "Mrs. Vance, let's be honest," she said, leaning forward with a smirk. "Your husband, Vice President JD Vance, has been part of one of the most controversial administrations in recent history. His policies on immigration, the economy, and social issues have been labeled extreme by many. How do you, as a woman of color and an accomplished professional, support an administration that seems to be rolling back progress?" The trap was set. The audience waited. The Twitter feeds buzzed. Would Usha fumble? Would she go defensive? Instead, she smiled calmly. "I find it interesting," she said smoothly, "that you assume supporting my husband means rolling back progress. I'd argue that progress isn't about one ideology winning over the other. It's about improving the lives of everyday Americans. And if we're honest, Rachel, a lot of Americans, especially working-class families, haven't seen much progress under the so-called policies you defend." Monroe blinked, clearly not expecting such a composed yet sharp rebuttal. She quickly recovered. "Well, let's talk about that," she said, flipping through her notes. "Your husband has been accused of using populism to push an agenda that benefits the wealthy. His tax policies." Usha held up a hand. "That's an interesting take. But tell me, Rachel, do you know the median household income in, say, Ohio?" Monroe faltered. Usha continued, "Because I do. And I also know that when JD talks about economic reform, he's talking about those families, middle America, the ones who felt ignored by the last few administrations. The ones who work hard, pay their taxes, and wonder why their grocery bills are going up while Washington elites are busy playing politics." A murmur rippled through the audience. Monroe shifted uncomfortably. "But let's be real, Mrs. Vance," she said, her voice tightening. "Your husband's stance on immigration has been widely criticized as xenophobic. How do you, as the daughter of immigrants, justify that?" Usha's expression didn't change. "I justify it," she said, "by actually reading policies instead of reacting to media narratives." The audience gasped. Monroe's face flushed. And just like that, America knew they were witnessing something extraordinary. Rachel Monroe, a seasoned host, had faced tough guests before. But something about Usha Vance's calm, laser-sharp responses unsettled her. She had expected hesitation, maybe even defensiveness, but Usha was completely in control. And now, the interview had taken a personal turn. Monroe forced a smile, trying to regain control. "Reading policies is one thing, but the reality is another, Mrs. Vance. Your husband's administration has implemented some of the strictest immigration policies in modern history. As a woman of Indian heritage, aren't you at least concerned about how these policies impact people like your own family?" Usha nodded as if she had been waiting for this question. She leaned forward slightly, locking eyes with Monroe. "Rachel, let's talk about reality," she said. "My parents immigrated to this country legally. They worked hard, followed the rules, and built a life here. I respect that process. But what I don't respect is when people, politicians, media figures, and activists conflate legal immigration with illegal immigration. They are not the same thing, and you know that." Monroe opened her mouth, but Usha wasn't done. "I want America to be a country where legal immigrants, like my parents, can thrive. But I also want an America where borders matter, where security matters. Why? Because without borders, there's no nation. And without a nation, there's no American dream for anyone." The audience stirred. Some people clapped. Others murmured in disbelief. Monroe blinked, struggling to shift the narrative. "Well, that's a convenient perspective," she shot back, "but studies show that strict immigration policies often lead to labor shortages and economic downturns. How do you respond to that?" Usha tilted her head slightly. "Studies show," she repeated. "Which studies?" "Because I've seen reports that show the opposite, that unchecked immigration depresses wages for low-income workers. I've seen reports that show how human trafficking increases when we have weak border enforcement. So," Usha didn't raise her voice, but her words carried weight. I've seen reports, she continued, that show how human trafficking increases when we have weak border enforcement. Do you know how many women and children are trafficked across our southern border every year, Rachel? Do you know how many fentanyl deaths are linked to illegal crossings? We aren't just talking about economic downturns, we're talking about human lives. Monroe hesitated, but she wasn't ready to concede. So, are you saying that your husband's administration is completely blameless when it comes to handling immigration? Usha let out a small, almost amused breath. No administration is blameless, Rachel. Immigration is a complex issue and JD knows that. But what I am saying is that demonizing people who want strong borders while ignoring the real dangers of weak enforcement is dishonest. And frankly, Americans are tired of the dishonesty. A murmur ran through the audience. Even some of Monroe's usual supporters were nodding along. This wasn't the defensive, pre-scripted talking points they had expected from Usha Vance. She was turning the conversation on its head. Monroe clenched her jaw. She knew she had to regain control before Usha dictated the entire interview. All right, she said, flipping through her notes. Let's shift gears a bit. Your husband and his party have also been accused of attacking women's rights, specifically reproductive rights. How do you, as a woman, respond to the criticism that conservative policies are setting women back decades? Usha's expression didn't waver. If anything, she looked even more prepared for this question than the last. Rachel, I find it fascinating when people say things like, as a woman, how can you support these policies? Because what that really means is, as a woman, you are only allowed to think one way. That's not feminism, that's intellectual control. The room went silent. Even Monroe seemed taken aback. Usha leaned forward. Real feminism, real empowerment means women should be able to think for themselves. And guess what? A lot of women don't buy into the idea that abortion is the only issue that defines us. We care about safe communities. We care about strong economies. We care about raising families in a society that values life. If someone disagrees with that, fine. But don't tell me I'm setting women back just because I don't conform to your political views. A slow clap started in the audience. It was hesitant at first, but then it spread. Monroe's face was red, but she pressed on. All right, she said, her voice sharp. Then let's talk about another issue, race. You're a woman of color in a political movement that, let's be honest, has struggled with diversity. Do you truly believe the conservative movement represents people like you? Usha smiled. I think the real question is, why does the media keep telling people like me that we don't belong? Monroe opened her mouth to respond, but Usha held up a hand. Let's be honest, Rachel. The conservative movement isn't perfect, but neither is the liberal movement. And yet, every time a woman of color supports conservative values, the media labels her a traitor or an outlier. Why? Because they're afraid. Afraid that more people might start thinking for themselves instead of following a pre-approved narrative. The audience was no longer just murmuring, they were reacting. Some were cheering, others were gasping, but no one was tuning out. Monroe shifted in her chair, clearly rattled. She had planned to corner Usha Vance. Instead, she had walked into a debate she was losing badly. Rachel Monroe took a deep breath. She wasn't used to losing control of an interview, but Usha Vance was proving to be an opponent unlike any she had faced before. The audience was no longer passively listening. They were engaged, reacting, and even applauding. She needed to regain control. Mrs. Vance, Monroe said, forcing a smile. You talk a lot about people thinking for themselves, but let's be real. Your husband is part of an administration that many see as authoritarian. The policies he supports on voting rights, government oversight, and even free speech are considered dangerous by many legal experts. How do you respond to the concern that your husband's party is eroding democracy? Usha didn't blink. If anything, she looked almost amused. Rachel, let's break that down for a second, she said, shifting slightly in her chair. When people talk about eroding democracy, what they usually mean is, we don't like how the other side is winning elections. A few chuckles rippled through the audience. Monroe's expression tightened. Let's talk about voting rights, Usha continued. You're referring to policies that require voter ID, correct? Monroe nodded. Yes, many critics argue that voter ID laws suppress marginalized communities. Usha tilted her head slightly. So, let me ask you this. If I want to get on a plane, I need an ID. If I want to buy certain medications, I need an ID. If I want to drive a car, I need an ID. Are you saying that asking for an ID to vote a process that determines the future of our country, is somehow unreasonable. Monroe hesitated. It's about accessibility, she said quickly. Many communities don't have the same access to IDs. Usha's eyebrows lifted. You think in 2025, Americans don't have access to IDs? That sounds more like an insult than an argument, Rachel. Laughter broke out in the audience. Monroe's face turned a shade redder. But let's go further, Usha said, her voice steady. You mentioned free speech. You claim my husband's party is a threat to it. But tell me, Rachel, who's actually suppressing speech in America right now? Monroe furrowed her brow. What do you mean? Usha leaned in. Let's look at the facts. When conservative speakers go to college campuses, they get shouted down or banned. When parents speak up at school board meetings, they get labeled as extremists. When journalists question certain narratives, they get deplatformed. And yet, you're telling me that JD Vance's administration is the real threat to free speech. The audience was fully engaged now. Some were clapping. Others were murmuring in disbelief. Monroe knew she was losing the crowd. She scrambled for another angle. But what about the January 6th riots? She said abruptly. Many people say your husband's party hasn't done enough to hold extremists accountable. Usha's expression didn't change. Rachel, do you believe in equal justice under the law? Monroe nodded. Of course. Then why is it, Usha said smoothly, that the riots of January 6th are treated as the greatest threat to democracy, but the months of violent riots in 2020, where businesses were burned, police officers were attacked, and entire cities were held hostage, are ignored? Why is one group labeled as domestic terrorists and the other as peaceful protesters? A gasp rippled through the crowd. Monroe was caught off guard. She opened her mouth, but Usha continued. The American people are not stupid, Rachel. They see the double standards. They see the selective outrage. And they're tired of being manipulated. The applause was loud now. Monroe swallowed hard, realizing that she had lost the upper hand. And Usha Vance wasn't finished. Rachel Monroe gripped the edges of her desk, her mind racing. This wasn't how the interview was supposed to go. Usha Vance had walked in as a guest, but somehow she had seized control of the entire conversation. The energy in the studio had shifted. Viewers at home could feel it. Twitter was on fire. Hashtag Usha Vance was already trending, and the interview wasn't even over yet. Monroe took a deep breath. She had to try one more time. All right, Mrs. Vance, she said, her voice a little sharper now. Let's talk about something personal. You are an accomplished lawyer, a successful woman in your own right. But let's not pretend that your rise wasn't helped by the very systems your husband's administration often criticizes. You went to Yale Law School. You've benefited from diversity programs. How do you reconcile that with the policies you and your husband now support? Usha smiled, but this time it wasn't just polite, it was razor sharp. Rachel, I appreciate the attempt, she said, tilting her head slightly. But let's get one thing straight. I didn't get into Yale because of a diversity program. I got in because I worked my tail off. The audience erupted. Monroe's lips parted slightly in shock. Usha continued, unfazed. And honestly, I find it offensive when people assume that women, or people of color, or anyone from a so-called marginalized background, only succeed because of special programs. That mindset isn't empowerment, it's condescension. The crowd was now fully behind Usha. Monroe knew it. But Usha wasn't done. Let's talk about opportunity since you brought it up, she said, her voice steady. I support policies that give people the tools to succeed, not policies that trap them in dependency. I believe in hard work, not handouts. And I believe that real equality doesn't come from lowering standards, it comes from raising people up. The audience burst into applause. Monroe clenched her jaw, struggling to stay composed. But don't you think, she tried again, that your views are out of touch with the struggles many Americans face? Usha's expression softened slightly. Rachel, I think you and I just have very different definitions of helping people. Monroe stayed silent. Usha continued. You believe helping people means giving them things. I believe helping people means giving them the ability to earn those things for themselves. That's the difference between government dependence and true opportunity. The room fell silent for a moment. Monroe had nothing. She had faced countless conservative guests before, politicians, commentators, even former presidents. But none had dismantled her arguments with such precision. Usha Vance hadn't just shut down Monroe. She had flipped the script on an entire political narrative on live television. And America had witnessed it. For the first time in her career, Rachel Monroe was speechless. The audience, the camera crew, and millions of viewers at home knew they had just witnessed something remarkable. Usha Vance had not only held her ground, she had completely flipped the conversation. Monroe cleared her throat, trying to salvage the moment. "Well, Mrs. Vance," she said, forcing a smile, "you certainly have strong opinions." Usha smiled back, perfectly composed. "I prefer to call it common sense." Laughter and applause erupted again. The energy in the room was undeniable. Monroe was out of moves, and she knew it. The interview was over, not because of time constraints, but because there was simply nowhere else to go. "Thank you for your time, Mrs. Vance," Monroe said, barely able to mask her frustration. "It was my pleasure," Usha responded smoothly. She stood, shook Monroe's hand, and walked off set with the quiet confidence of someone who knew she had just changed the game. The internet explosion. Within minutes, clips from the interview flooded social media. Conservative commentators praised Usha for her poise and intelligence. Even some liberals admitted that she had delivered a masterclass in debate. Hashtag Usha Vance Destroys began trending on X, formerly Twitter. Memes exploded across Instagram and TikTok. One clip where Usha said, "I didn't get into Yale because of a diversity program. I got in because I worked my tail off," racked up over 20 million views in the first 12 hours. Major media outlets scrambled to react. Some tried to downplay the moment. Others ran op-eds questioning whether Usha was the new face of conservative women in America. Meanwhile, JD Vance's approval ratings saw an immediate boost. Conservative donors reached out, seeing in Usha a powerful new voice for their movement. Rachel Monroe's fallout. As for Rachel Monroe, the fallout was brutal. Critics accused her of being unprepared, of underestimating Usha, of failing to control her own interview. Some media watchdogs even suggested that she had walked into an ideological buzzsaw without realizing it. By the next day, her network had quietly pulled the interview from its front page. But it was too late. The internet had already made its decision. The legacy of a single interview. That night, as Usha Vance sat with her husband watching the media frenzy unfold, she simply smiled. "Are you surprised?" JD asked. Usha shook her head. "No," she said. "The truth is powerful. And tonight, America heard it." And with that, she sipped her tea, knowing that this was only the beginning.